The scorching Idaho sun beat down on the plain as North Wind watched the stagecoach pass through Blackfoot country. His dark eyes, sharp as an eagle's, didn't miss a single movement of the wheels kicking up dust on the horizon. From his high perch in the Rocky Hills, he could see everything without being noticed, an ability that had saved his life countless times since the massacre of his village 7 years ago. The memory of that night still burned in his memory like a hot iron. The screams, the smell of gunpowder, the flames devouring the teepees, and the face of the man responsible for it all, Samuel Richardson, the peacemaker who had promised the Blackfoot peace only to betray them under cover of darkness. A gust of wind ruffled the eagle feathers braided in her long black hair, bringing with it the distant sound of gunfire. North Wind sat up straight on his horse, muscles taut as bowstrings. The stagecoach had stopped, surrounded by a dozen horsemen, bandits. For a moment, he considered simply watching. After all, why should you care about white people's problems? But something compelled him to act, perhaps the last remnant of his father's teachings about honor and courage, or perhaps just the desire to feel the taste of battle again. Without hesitation, he led his horse down the hill, silent as a shadow. As he got closer, he could make out the scene better. 3 dead men, the coachman and 2 guards, and a young woman being dragged out of the stagecoach by a grey-bearded bandit. "Look what we have here, boys!" shouted the leader of the bandits, pulling the young woman by her hair. "A true society lady!" The girl fought with a ferocity that surprised North Wind. Her copper hair shone in the midday sun as she struggled, even managing to land a punch on her captor's jaw. "You savage!" roared the bandit, raising his hand to strike her. It was at this moment that North Wind attacked. His first shot knocked down the man holding the young woman, and the next ones found 2 more bandits before the group could react properly. The surprise of the sudden attack caused confusion among the thieves, who were unable to identify where the shots were coming from. Clara Richardson, although North Wind did not yet know her name, took advantage of the chaos to run towards a nearby rock formation. 2 bandits tried to chase her, but were met by more accurate shots from the Blackfoot warrior. The survivors, realizing they were at a disadvantage against an unseen sniper, opted to retreat, galloping west in a cloud of dust and curses. North Wind waited until they were far enough away before emerging from his hiding place. He cautiously approached the rock formation where the young woman had hidden. "You're safe now," he announced in English, his deep voice carrying only a slight accent. "You can leave." Clara slowly emerged, her wide green eyes mixing fear and fascination as she watched her savior. She was dirty and a little bruised, but she maintained a dignified posture that caught the attention of North Wind. "I appreciate your help," she said, straightening her rumpled dress. "I'm Clara Richardson. I was on my way to Fort Harrison to—" The name hit North Wind like a physical blow, although he kept his expression impassive. Richardson. The daughter of the man who had destroyed his life was there, in front of him, completely vulnerable. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. "North Wind," he introduced himself simply, fighting against the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overflow in his chest. "That's an interesting name," she commented, taking a step towards him. "You saved my life. I don't know how I can ever repay you." The Blackfoot warrior watched her in silence for a few moments. It would be so easy to complete his revenge right then and there, to make Samuel Richardson feel the same pain he had felt when he lost his family. But something in her eyes, an innocence mixed with strength of spirit, made him hesitate. "Fort Harrison is 2 days' travel away," he said finally. "Dangerous territory to travel alone." "Are you offering to escort me?" she asked, a small smile appearing on her lips. North Wind nodded, knowing he was possibly making the biggest mistake of his life. But he also knew he couldn't just abandon her there, nor did he have the courage to hurt her father. At least not yet. "We will need provisions," he declared, turning to the looted stagecoach, "and a horse for you." As he helped Clara retrieve what she could of her luggage and prepared for the journey, North Wind felt the weight of fate on her shoulders. The Great Spirit had placed his enemy's daughter in his path. Was this a test of his honor or an opportunity for revenge? As the sun began its descent over the horizon, the two set off together across the wild prairie. Clara Richardson, unaware that she was riding alongside the last survivor of a village her father had destroyed, and North Wind, carrying the burden of a secret that could both destroy and save them. The wind blew through the tall grass, carrying with it the seeds of a story that would forever change both of their lives. A story of revenge, redemption, and a love that would defy the scars of the past. The first night of the trip brought with it a heavy silence between the two travelers. Clara watched her mysterious protector with barely concealed curiosity as he lit the fire with the precision of someone who had lived his entire life on the prairies. The dancing flames cast restless shadows over her striking features, highlighting the indigenous features that intrigued her so much. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" Clara finally broke the silence, adjusting the skirt of her dress as she sat on a blanket spread out next to the fire. North Wind looked up from the task of preparing the dried meat they had salvaged from the stagecoach. "Unnecessary words are like smoke in the wind," he replied, his deep voice carrying a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. Clara smiled, recognizing the poetic truth in his words. "Still, I would like to get to know the man who saved my life better. You are not like the other natives I have met." The mention of his origin made North Wind imperceptibly tighten the hilt of his knife. How many times had Samuel Richardson said something similar before he betrayed his people? "And how many natives have you met, Miss Richardson?" "Few," she admitted, her green eyes reflecting the flames. "My father, he works on Indian affairs, but he always kept our family away from his business." Business, thought North Wind bitterly. Was that what they called the massacre of innocence? But he kept his expression neutral, years of practice at hiding his emotions serving him well at this moment. "Your father must be an important man," he commented, testing the waters. "That's what they say," Clara replied, with a tone that surprised North Wind. Was there a note of disapproval there? "But I prefer not to talk about him. I'm traveling precisely to find my own path." The Blackfoot warrior found himself genuinely interested. "Running away from something?" "Not exactly," she hesitated, playing with a strand of copper hair. "Let's say my father has plans for me that don't match my own dreams." "An arranged marriage," he deduced, serving her a serving of dried meat. Clara accepted the food with a nod of thanks. "With a respectable merchant from Boston, someone I've never met in my life, but who, according to my father, will bring stability and important connections to the family." The irony of the situation did not escape Vento do Norte. The daughter of the man who had destroyed her life was, herself, running away from her father's impositions. Destiny had peculiar ways of weaving its plots. "And what are you looking for?" he asked, surprising himself with his own interest. "Freedom," she replied without hesitation. "Chance to choose my own path. Fort Harrison has a pioneer school for children. I plan to be a teacher." The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the campfire and the night sounds of the prairie. Clara watched her companion with growing curiosity, noticing how he seemed lost in distant thoughts. "Your clothes," she commented after a while, "are an interesting mix of styles." In fact, North Wind wore white-style leather pants, but maintained traditional Blackfoot elements on his vest and the various amulets he carried. It was a reflection of his own existence, divided between two worlds. "Adaptation," he replied simply. "It is necessary to survive." "But he hasn't forgotten his roots," she noted admiringly. "It must be difficult to maintain your traditions in a world that changes so quickly." Something about the sincerity in her voice made North Wind look at her more closely. How could this young woman, raised in comfort and privilege, demonstrate such understanding? How could Samuel Richardson's daughter have developed a conscience that her father never possessed? "The world always changes," he said finally, "but some things remain constant like the stars." Clara raised her eyes to the night sky, where thousands of luminous points shone like jewels spread over black velvet. "Like what?" "Honor, truth, justice." Each word carried the weight of his own experiences, his own losses. "And love?" she asked softly, her eyes meeting his through the flames. North Wind felt his heart tighten. How could he answer that question when his own heart was torn between the attraction he was beginning to feel for her and the hatred he had for his father? "Love is like the wind," he replied after a moment. "It can bring both the gentle breeze of spring and the storm that destroys everything in its path." Clara shivered, not from the cold, but from the intensity in his voice. "It seems like you speak from experience." "We all have our stories," he deflected, standing up to feed the fire. "You should rest. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow." As Clara settled into her blanket, North Wind took first watch, her eyes alternating between the darkness around her and her companion's sleeping face. The crescent moon shed its silvery light over Clara's delicate features, and he found himself imagining how different it would be if they had met under different circumstances. But the past was like a shadow that followed him, impossible to ignore or forget. With each peaceful moment with her, memories of the massacre came back to haunt him. The crying of children, the despair of mothers, the wounded pride of betrayed warriors. And now, under the same stars that had witnessed that night of horror, he found himself torn between the duty to avenge his people and a dawning feeling that threatened to change everything he believed in. The night wind whispered through the tall grass, bringing with it the distant howl of a coyote, a reminder of the wilderness that surrounded them and the dangers that still lay ahead. But at that moment, the greatest danger for North Wind was not the bandits or the beasts, but rather his own treacherous heart, which was beginning to see beauty where it should have seen only revenge. The second day of the journey dawned with dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. North Wind watched the sky with concern as he saddled the horses. Years of living on the prairies had taught him to read the weather signs, and those clouds promised a violent storm. "We need to find shelter before the storm reaches us," he said to Clara, who was finishing packing her belongings. "There's an old abandoned mission a few hours away." Clara nodded, adjusting her horse's reins. During the night, she had noticed how her protector had remained vigilant, almost restless. Something in his dark eyes seemed different this morning, as if an internal battle was raging behind that stoic facade. "You didn't sleep well," she commented, as they rode side by side across the rolling prairie. North Wind kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. How could he explain that he had spent the night tormented by nightmares, where her face mixed with the flames that had consumed his village? How could he admit that her every smile made his heart war against his revenge? "The wind brought restless dreams," he replied simply. Clara studied her profile for a moment. "You know, sometimes I think you carry a very heavy burden. I can see it in your eyes." Her insight disturbed him. "We all carry our burdens, Miss Richardson." "Clara," she corrected softly. "Please call me Clara. Miss Richardson Makes me feel like I'm back in those stuffy Boston halls. Distant thunder reverberated across the prairie, as if the sky itself protested the growing kindness between them. The wind began to blow more strongly, bringing with it the unmistakable smell of rain. "The mission isn't far away," said North Wind, picking up his pace. "But the storm is faster." The first drops began to fall when they saw the stone building on the horizon. It was a solid building, built by Spanish missionaries decades ago, and now abandoned to the elements on the border. The stone walls still stood firm, although the roof had some flaws. They reached the mission just when the storm broke in all its fury. North Wind helped Clara dismount and led the horses to what remained of the adjacent stable. Inside the main church, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and damp earth. "It's almost beautiful in a melancholy way," Clara observed, looking at the remains of religious paintings on the walls. The light from the lightning flashed through the glassless windows, creating dancing shadows that seemed to bring the sacred figures to life. North Wind began to organize a makeshift camp, spreading blankets over the stone floor. The sound of the rain hitting the roof created a strange feeling of intimacy, as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving just the two of them in that sacred space. "Why did you choose to help me?" Clara asked suddenly, sitting down on one of the blankets. "You could have just gone on your way after chasing away the bandits." The question caught North Wind off guard. Why indeed? It would have been easier to have let the bandits do the work for him, eliminating his enemy's daughter without getting his own hands dirty. But the idea disgusted him. "My father," he began slowly, "taught that our actions define who we are. I couldn't abandon someone in danger even if I'm white," she added, her voice soft. "Even if the world expects that from me," he corrected, meeting her eyes. A silence full of meaning settled between them, broken only by the roar of the storm. Clara got up and walked to one of the windows, watching the curtain of rain falling outside. "Sometimes I wonder," she said, "if we will ever be able to overcome all these barriers we have built between us. White and native, rich and poor, east and west." "Some barriers are built with blood," North Wind replied, his voice filled with a bitterness he could not contain. "They're not that easy to take down." Clara turned to him, her green eyes glowing with an intensity that reminded him of his childhood stories about forest spirits that captured unsuspecting souls. "You speak like someone who knows pain well," she said, taking a step toward him. "What happened to you, North Wind? What made you so marked?" The Blackfoot warrior felt his heart quicken. He was dangerously close to revealing everything: the massacre, his quest for revenge, the truth about who her father was. But how could I destroy the purity of that moment? How could he tarnish the confidence he saw in her eyes? "The past is like this storm," he said finally. "Sometimes all we can do is seek shelter and wait for it to pass." Clara got closer until she was just a few steps away from him. "What if I told you that I want to help carry this burden? That maybe together we can—" A deafening thunder interrupted her words, making her jump in fright. Instinctively, North Wind grabbed her by the arms, and suddenly they were very close, breaths mixing, hearts beating in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the shock of thunder. "I shouldn't trust a stranger so much," he murmured, but didn't let go of her. "Maybe," she replied, her eyes fixed on his. "But my heart says I can trust you." North Wind closed his eyes, fighting the overwhelming desire to kiss her. How could the Great Spirit be so cruel as to make him fall in love with the daughter of the man who had destroyed everything he loved? The storm continued to rage outside, mirroring the turmoil in his own heart. And there, in the ruins of an ancient mission, among shadows of long-forgotten saints, North Wind realized he was losing the battle against his own feelings. And the scariest thing was that a part of him didn't care about losing. The storm continued through the night, keeping North Wind and Clara refugees in the old mission. Dawn brought with it clear skies and palpable tension between the two travelers. The almost kiss from the night before hung between them like an unanswered question, making even the simplest tasks loaded with meaning. The rain made the paths muddy, noted North Wind as he checked the conditions of the terrain around the mission. "We will need to be cautious." Clara nodded, busy reorganizing her belongings. A small book slipped out of her bag, falling open to the stone floor. North Wind caught it before she could reach it, her eyes instantly catching the name engraved on the first page, "Property of Samuel Richardson." The diary of the man who had destroyed her life was there, in her hands. Clara noticed the change in his expression, the way his fingers twitched against the leather cover. "It's my father's diary," she explained, reaching out to take it. "I met him in his office before I left. I thought maybe..." "Maybe what?" His voice came out harsher than he intended. "Maybe it would help me understand," she replied, her words filled with a sadness that surprised him. "There's so much I don't know about him, about the decisions he made. Sometimes I feel like I barely know him." North Wind felt his heart tighten. If only she knew the truth about her father, about the blood on his hands. She returned the diary with studied care, fighting the urge to reveal everything right then. "We don't always want to know the truth about those we love," he said, turning to the horses. "That's what scares me the most," Clara continued, following him. "The pages I read. There are records of negotiations with indigenous tribes, broken agreements, mentions of necessary measures that make me uneasy. And there is something more." North Wind stopped checking the reins, his body tense as a bowstring. "What?" "An entrance about a Blackfoot village." She hesitated, watching his reaction closely. "Dated 7 years ago. His words are cold, clinical, as if he were describing a business transaction. "No, not the massacre of innocents," he added, his voice low and dangerous. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara took a step back, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. Were you there?" North Wind closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 7 years of secrets crumbling away. When he opened them again, there was a hardness in his gaze that made Clara shudder. "I wasn't just there," he said, each word filled with restrained pain. "I lost everything that night. My family, my people, my innocence. Your father promised peace and brought death." Clara put her hands over her mouth, horror and understanding mixing on her face. "That's why you saved me. That's why you're following me. Is it about revenge?" "It was meant to be," he admitted, his voice now softer, almost defeated. "But then you—" "So what am I?" she asked, taking a step towards him, despite the fear visible in her eyes. "You are not your father," he replied simply. "You have light where he has darkness, compassion where he has cruelty." Tears began to stream down Clara's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for what he did, for what you lost." "It's not your apology I need," he said, fighting the urge to wipe away his tears. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you going to kill me to get revenge on him?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "No," he replied firmly. "I can't. Not after..." "After what?" "After knowing your heart," he added, finally admitting to himself what he had known for days. Clara crossed the distance between them, placing a trembling hand on his chest. "So there is hope for us, even with all this blood and pain between our families?" North Wind covered her hand with his own. "The path ahead of us is like crossing a river in a storm, dangerous, uncertain. But not impossible," she added, her green eyes shining with determination through the tears. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted the moment. North Wind quickly moved to the window, his body instantly tense. A group of horsemen approached the mission, and among them, mounted on a black horse, was Samuel Richardson. "Your father," he said, turning to Clara. "He found us." The blood left her face. "As?" "He must have followed your leads since the stagecoach was attacked," he replied, already calculating his options. "Clara, you need to decide now. Whose side are you on?" She looked from the window at him, her hands clutching her father's diary. "On the side of truth," he finally replied. "On the side of justice. On your side." The sound of the riders grew closer by the second. North Wind knew that the next decisions they made would change their lives forever. The revenge he had planned for so long was within his reach, but the price would be losing the only person who had made his heart beat again since the massacre. "Then we must leave," he said, picking up his weapons. "And quickly." Fate had woven a complex plot between them, and now it was time to find out if their love would be strong enough to survive the storms that were to come. As they prepared to flee, they both knew there was no turning back. They were in this together, for better or for worse. The sun had not yet reached its zenith when North Wind and Clara galloped away from the old mission, their horses kicking up clouds of dust on the wet prairie after the storm. The Blackfoot warrior had chosen a route through a rocky canyon, hoping that the rugged terrain would make it difficult for Samuel Richardson and his men to pursue. "My father won't give up easily," Clara shouted over the sound of hooves. "He never accepts losing control of anything or anyone." North Wind nodded grimly, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "I know his determination well," he replied, the bitterness in his voice barely contained. "But now he's facing someone who has as much to lose as he does." A shot echoed through the canyon, the bullet ricocheting off nearby rocks. Clara stifled a scream as North Wind pulled on her horse's reins, guiding them behind a rock formation. "Snipers on the hills," he muttered, quickly dismounting and helping Clara do the same. "Your father brought reinforcements. He's always been good at getting allies when he needs to eliminate problems," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly as she realized the extent of her own father's cruelty. More shots ripped through the air, forcing them to duck even lower. North Wind could see at least 3 snipers positioned at the edges of the canyon, and the distant sound of hooves indicated that the main group was not far away. "Clara," he said, holding her by the shoulders and looking deeply into her eyes, "I need you to trust me now more than ever." She nodded, her green eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "I trust you with my life." "There's an ancient Blackfoot trail through these rocks," he explained quickly, checking his weapons. "It's narrow and dangerous, but it will lead us to a valley where we can hide. I need you to take the horses through it while I distract the snipers." "No!" she protested, grabbing his arm. "It's suicide to face them alone." A sad smile crossed the warrior's lips. "I survived the massacre of my village. I can survive this." "But what if—" Clara began, but was interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice echoing through the canyon. "Clara! I know you're there, daughter!" Samuel Richardson's voice thundered between the rocky walls. "This savage is manipulating you. Go home and we can forget all this nonsense." Clara felt North Wind's body tense at the sound of that voice, years of repressed hatred threatening to boil over. She held his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Don't let him make you what he is," she whispered. "You're better than this. We're better than this." The warrior closed his eyes for a moment, letting her touch calm the storm in his heart. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his eyes. "The trail starts behind that arrow-shaped formation," he instructed, indicating with a gesture. "Head north and don't stop for anything. I'll meet you in the valley on the other side. Promise you'll come back to me, she demanded, her hands still on his face. In response, North Wind pulled her into an intense kiss, years of loneliness and pain dissolving in the heat of that moment. When they separated, both panting, he placed his forehead against hers. Not even your father can stop me now, he promised. Clara reluctantly walked away, guiding the horses toward the hidden trail. North Wind waited until she was safe, before moving to a better position, her rifle ready. "Richardson," he shouted, his voice echoing across the canyon, "do you still remember the promise you made to my people, or are your words as empty as your honor?" The silence that followed was tense, charged with recognition. When Samuel Richardson spoke again, his voice had lost its false fatherly concern. "So it's you," he said, bitterness in every word. "The son of that fool who believed we could coexist peacefully." "My father was no fool," roared North Wind, firing a well-aimed shot that felled one of the shooters. "He believed a white man's word. That was his only mistake." The gunfight that followed was brutal and precise. North Wind moved among the rocks like a shadow, years of experience in hunting and surviving transformed into a deadly dance. 2 shooters fell before they could adjust their aim, and a third retreated with a shoulder wound. "You can't protect her forever," Richardson shouted, his frustration evident. "Clara belongs in the civilized world, not a vengeful savage." "She belongs to herself," replied North Wind, reloading his rifle. "Something you never understood." A movement in the corner of his eye alerted him to flanking. Spinning quickly, he managed to take down another of Richardson's men, but not before he felt the sting of a bullet grazing his arm. The sound of Clara's hooves had already faded into the distance, giving North Wind the certainty that she was following the safe trail. Now it was time for his own escape. With one last volley of gunfire to keep his pursuers down, he ran toward a side passage he knew well. A dangerous shortcut few would dare take. The sound of frustration and shouted orders behind him confirmed that his strategy had worked. As he climbed the slippery rocks, his injured arm protesting with every movement, North Wind allowed himself a small smile. Samuel Richardson might have had all the power and influence of the civilized world, but these lands still held secrets that only the Blackfoot knew. And now, for the first time in 7 years, his revenge had turned into something greater, not just the destruction of an enemy, but the protection of a love that defied all the boundaries men had created between their people. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon when North Wind finally reached the top of the canyon. In front of him, the promised valley spread like a green blanket, and somewhere below, Clara waited for him. With one last look at the path he had left behind, he began his descent, knowing that the real battle, not just for their lives, but for their future together, was just beginning. The valley spread out before Clara like a golden-green tapestry in the afternoon sun. Following North Wind's instructions, she had guided the horses along the narrow trail until she found a small forest near a stream, where she decided to wait for her beloved. The distant sound of gunfire had ceased some time ago, leaving her in a state of distressing uncertainty. Every minute of waiting was torture. Clara alternated between watching the horizon and rereading excerpts from her father's diary, each page revealing more about the man she thought she knew. The entries about the Blackfoot village massacre were particularly disturbing, cold, calculating, justifying the unjustifiable in the name of progress and civilization. "How could I be so blind?" she muttered to herself, closing the diary tightly as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of crimson that resembled spilled blood. A noise among the trees made her stand up suddenly, her hand going instinctively to the small pistol that North Wind had insisted she carry. His heart raced as a figure emerged from the shadows, but soon calmed as he recognized the Blackfoot warrior's graceful movements. "You're hurt," she exclaimed, running towards him when she noticed the blood on his arm. "Just a scratch," he replied, allowing her to guide him to a flat rock near the stream. "Your father trained his men well, but not well enough." Clara tore off a piece of her petticoat to make a bandage, her fingers shaking slightly as she cleaned the wound with water from the stream. "How many—" "I didn't kill anyone," he replied, understanding her unspoken question. "A few injuries, nothing serious. I don't want to give your father any more reasons to chase us." The relief on her face was visible. "You're a better man than he ever was," he said softly, finishing the bandage. "It's not a question of being better," replied North Wind, holding her hands in his. "It's a matter of choosing what kind of man I want to be. For a long time, I lived only for revenge. You reminded me that there is more to life." Clara moved closer, resting her forehead against his. "Where do we go now?" "Fort Harrison is out of the question. That would be the first place they would look." "I know a place," he said after a moment's reflection. "In the mountains north of here, there is a hidden valley where some of my Blackfoot brothers found refuge after the massacre, people who chose peace over revenge." "Would they accept us? A white woman and a warrior who abandoned revenge?" North Wind smiled, a rare gesture that brightened his normally serious face. "The elder who leads the group, Wise Bear, was a friend of my father. He always said that the true test of a warrior is not how many enemies he kills, but how many lives he chooses to spare." The sound of distant hooves brought them back to the reality of their situation. Clara quickly began to gather her belongings while North Wind checked the horses. "We need to leave now," he said, helping her mount. "Your tracks are well hidden, but your father is stubborn. He will keep looking." "How did my father become like this?" Clara asked as they rode north, the setting sun at their backs. "In the diary, there are moments when he seems almost human. He talks about peace, about building bridges between people, and then—" "Power changes men," replied North Wind, his voice filled with bitter knowledge. "Some manage to resist his seduction, others lose themselves in him. Your father chose to lose himself." They rode in silence for some time, the terrain gradually becoming rougher as they approached the mountains. The first stars were beginning to appear in the sky when North Wind signaled them to stop in a small clearing protected by tall rocks. "We need to rest," he said, dismounting and helping Clara do the same. "The trail to the valley is treacherous during the day. It would be suicidal to attempt it at night." As they prepared a small camp, Clara noticed how North Wind seemed more relaxed, as if every mile that took them away from her father lifted a weight from her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting down next to him after they finished a frugal meal. "How strange life is," he replied, his eyes reflecting the glow of the small fire. "For 7 years, I lived to get revenge on your father. Now, I'm running away with your daughter, not to hurt him, but to protect her from him." Clara intertwined her fingers with his. "Maybe this is how we break the cycle of violence, by choosing love over revenge, one person at a time." North Wind pulled her closer, wrapping her in his arms. "My people have a history," he began, his voice low and melodious in the still night. "About 2 stars who fell in love, even though they belonged to different constellations. Their people tried to keep them apart, but they chose to fall from the sky together, preferring to shine on the earth like wildflowers than live apart in the stars." "And were they happy?" Clara asked, snuggling closer into his embrace. "The story says that your souls still dance together in every wildflower that blooms on the prairies," he replied, kissing her forehead softly, reminding everyone that true love knows no borders. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled only by the crackling fire and the nighttime sounds of nature. They both knew the next few days would be difficult, Samuel Richardson would not give up easily, and the path to the Blackfoot Valley would be challenging. But in that moment, under a starry sky that seemed to bless their unlikely union, they found peace in the certainty of their love. "Promise us that we'll be together," whispered Clara, already half asleep in his arms. "No matter what happens." "Until the stars fall from the sky," replied North Wind, sealing his promise with a soft kiss on her lips. The night wore on, and with it grew the hope of a future where love could triumph over hate, where the scars of the past could finally begin to heal. On the horizon, mountains stood like silent guardians of their dreams, promising refuge for two hearts who had chosen to defy the destiny others had carved out for them. Dawn brought with it a leaden sky and an icy breeze coming down from the mountains. North Wind and Clara began their journey even before the first rays of sun, knowing that they needed to take advantage of every moment of advantage over their pursuers. The trail they followed gradually became steeper, winding between rugged rocks and ancient pine trees. "My people called this path the Shadow Trail," explained North Wind, guiding his horse carefully through a narrow passage. It was said that here the spirits of ancestors walk alongside travelers, testing their courage and determination. Clara observed the rocky walls that rose on both sides, noticing ancient indigenous paintings half erased by time. "It feels like we're riding through history," she commented, her voice soft with reverence. A distant noise made North Wind stop abruptly, her heightened senses picking up on something Clara hadn't yet noticed. "Horses," he muttered, dismounting quickly. "At least half a dozen, coming from the south." "My father?" Clara asked, feeling her heart accelerate. "No," he replied, helping her dismount. "The rhythm of the hooves is different. Those are the bandits who attacked us earlier. They must have joined your father in the pursuit." They led the horses behind a rock formation, where North Wind quickly began to cover their tracks with a pine branch. Clara anxiously watched the way they had come, her hand nervously clutching her father's diary to her chest. "There's a natural cave ahead," whispered North Wind, finishing camouflaging his footprints. "If we can reach it without being seen, we can hide until they pass." But before they could move, the sound of harsh voices echoed off the canyon walls. "Look at this, boys!" shouted a familiar voice, the leader of the bandits who had attacked the stagecoach. "Fresh tracks leading straight to our trap." Clara and North Wind exchanged tense glances. They were trapped between the bandits approaching from the south and the increasingly treacherous terrain ahead. The Blackfoot warrior quickly assessed his options, his dark eyes scanning the room for a way out. "Clara," he said softly, "how much do you trust me?" "With my life," she replied without hesitation. "Then I need you to do something that goes against all your instincts," he continued, taking the reins of both horses. "I'll release the horses to create a distraction. While the bandits chase them, we'll climb." He pointed to a rock wall that rose almost vertically beside them. Clara swallowed hard, but nodded determinedly. North Wind quickly tied a rope around her waist, connecting her to his. "Don't look down," he instructed. "Just focus on placing your hands and feet where I place mine." With a well-aimed slap, he sent the horses galloping back the way they came. The bandits' excited screams confirmed that the distraction had worked. Wasting no time, North Wind began the climb, guiding Clara with gentle, precise instructions. "Your injured arm," she whispered worriedly, noticing how he occasionally suppressed a grimace of pain. "I've endured worse," he replied, reaching a small ledge where they could rest briefly. "Besides, I have a very special reason for staying alive now." The sound of gunfire and swearing echoed below them. Apparently the bandits had discovered that the horses were without riders. Clara pressed herself against the rocky wall, her heart hammering in her chest. "They must be around here somewhere," a voice shouted. "Search every stone." "We must continue," murmured North Wind, already looking for the next handhold. "There is a natural platform a few meters above. From there, we can reach an old hunting path that will take us straight to the valley." The climb seemed endless. Every movement required total concentration. Every loose stone represented a mortal danger. Clara discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed, driven by a combination of fear and determination. North Wind, despite the pain in his injured arm, showed no hesitation, guiding her with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of those walls. Finally, they reached the promised platform. It was more spacious than it looked from below, forming a sort of natural, shallow cave. Clara collapsed against the stone wall exhaustedly, while North Wind checked the path ahead. "We did it," she whispered, still barely believing they had escaped. "Not yet," he replied, his expression serious. "The way to the valley is long, and now we have two groups hunting us." "Why don't they give up?" Clara asked, frustration in her voice. "Why can't you just leave us alone?" North Wind sat down next to her, allowing himself a moment of rest. "Your father will never accept losing control over you, and those thugs were probably hired by him. Men like them will do anything for money." "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it," Clara admitted softly. "All this fighting, all this danger." North Wind held her face in his hands, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. "Worth every moment," he said firmly, "because we are fighting not just for ourselves, but for something bigger. We are proving that love can be stronger than hate, that we can choose a different path." Clara covered his hands with her own, silent tears streaming down her face. "When this is all over," she said, "I want to build a life where other people can find hope. Maybe a school, like I dreamed of, but one where all children are welcome, regardless of their background. And I'll be by your side," he promised, kissing her softly. "Teaching young people that there is more than one way to be strong, more than one way to be brave." The sun was high in the sky as they resumed their journey, following the ancient hunting path that wound up the mountain face. Below them, they could occasionally hear the frustrated screams of their pursuers, but up here, close to the clouds, it seemed like they were in another world. A world where a Blackfoot warrior and his enemy's daughter could dream of a future together, where old wounds could begin to heal, and where love had the chance to prove itself stronger than any hatred or prejudice. But the journey was far from over, and the Blackfoot Valley was still just a distant promise on the horizon. The Blackfoot Valley was only a day's journey away when the storm reached them. Dark clouds rolled across the mountains like a herd of angry buffalo, bringing with them piercing gusts of icy wind. North Wind and Clara had found shelter in a natural cave, large enough to protect them from the elements, but not from the cold that seeped through its rocky walls. "We need to make a fire," said North Wind, arranging the firewood they had collected before the rain began. "The night will be long and cold." Clara watched him work, noticing how his injured arm still bothered him, even though he tried to hide it. The makeshift bandage needed to be changed, and she could see patches of fresh blood breaking through the fabric. "Let me take care of this," she insisted, grabbing the medical supplies they had managed to salvage. "We can't risk infection." As she cleaned and rebandaged, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the roar of the wind outside and the crackle of the small fire that North Wind had managed to light. "Something worries him," Clara observed. It wasn't a question. He knew her expression too well now not to notice the shadow that passed across her eyes. "The spirits are restless," he replied after a moment. "This storm is not natural. It is a warning." "What kind of notice?" North Wind fixed his gaze on the dancing flames. "When I was a boy, my father taught me to read signs. A storm like this, coming from the north when it should be coming from the west, means that great changes are at hand. Important choices will need to be made." As if to emphasize his words, a thunderous clap of thunder shook the cave walls, making Clara instinctively approach him. North Wind wrapped her in his arms, feeling how she trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion and worry. "I have something for you," she said softly, reaching for her bag. He took out his father's diary, its pages now yellowed and stained from the journey. "I want you to read this. All the pages about that night. About your village." North Wind hesitated, his hands hovering over the book as if he might burn it. "Why?" "Because I need you to understand," she replied, her green eyes shining with determination. "Not to justify his actions. Nothing could justify them. But to see that even in the midst of the darkness, there were others who tried to stop the massacre. People who opposed my father, who tried to warn their village." With hands that shook slightly, North Wind opened the diary. In the flickering light of the fire, he began to read Samuel Richardson's detailed records of the events that had changed his life forever. Clara watched his expression change as he progressed through the pages. Pain, anger, surprise, and finally, grim realization. "There were traitors on both sides," he muttered, closing the diary. "Some of our own warriors sold information to your father, while other white people tried to warn us. The world is rarely as simple as we would like it to be," Clara said softly. "Good and evil, right and wrong. Sometimes the lines are blurrier than they seem." North Wind was silent for a long moment, his hands still resting on the diary. "For years, I fed my hatred like it was a sacred fire. It was easier to see all white people as enemies, just as your father chose to see all natives as savages. But you—" "I what?" she asked when he hesitated. "You showed me that there is another way," he added, touching her face gently. "A path where revenge is not the only answer, where love can be stronger than hate." A sudden noise at the cave entrance made them freeze. North Wind moved silently to the entrance, his rifle at the ready. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. "North Wind!" a familiar voice called through the storm. "I know you're in there, brother." The Blackfoot warrior visibly relaxed, lowering his weapon. "Swift Eagle?" A man emerged from the storm, shaking water from his clothes. He was older than North Wind, with long grey braids and sharp eyes that seemed to see into the soul. "Wise Bear sent me," said the newcomer, approaching the fire. "We had signs that you were coming home, and not alone." His eyes fell on Clara, studying her with intensity, but without hostility. "Richardson's daughter," he said simply. "Spirits have an interesting sense of humor." "How did you find us?" asked North Wind, offering his friend a dry blanket. "Follow the signs and the tracks of the men in pursuit," replied Swift Eagle, accepting the blanket with a nod of thanks. "Your father is gathering more men at Fort Harrison," he told Clara. "And the bandits are still in the mountains, searching. You need to make a decision, and quickly." "What decision?" Clara asked, although she already knew the answer in her heart. "The valley is protected by our warriors," Swift Eagle explained. "But if we are going to shelter you two, we need to be sure. This is not just a romantic getaway for young lovers. It is a choice that will affect two nations." North Wind and Clara exchanged glances, years of conflict and the possibilities of peace weighing on their shoulders. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if the spirits themselves were awaiting their decision. "There is no choice to make," Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We have already chosen our path. Now we need to have the courage to follow it until the end." North Wind took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Together," he stated, and it was not just a word, but a promise. Fast Eagle watched the couple with an enigmatic smile, as if he saw beyond the present moment into a future that only spirits knew. Then rest tonight, he said. Tomorrow, when the storm passes, I will guide you to the valley, and may the spirits protect us all from what is to come. Dawn brought with it the end of the storm and a heavy silence over the mountains. Swift Eagle led the way along nearly invisible trails, with North Wind and Clara carefully following in his footsteps. The cool morning air carried the scent of wet pine trees and the promise of change. The valley is just beyond that ridge, Swift Eagle announced, pointing to a rock formation ahead. But first we need to discuss something important. They stopped in a small clearing, where remnants of melted snow still clung to the shadows. Clara noticed how North Wind tensed, recognizing something in her friend's tone that she still didn't fully understand. Wise Bear had a vision, Swift Eagle continued, his ancient eyes fixed on North Wind. He saw two paths unfolding before you. One leads to peace but requires a great sacrifice. The other leads to war, added North Wind, his voice deep. Samuel Richardson will not easily give up his daughter nor his revenge against our people. Clara took a step forward, her face determined despite her obvious fatigue. My father needs to be stopped. What he did to his village, what he plans to do to others, I cannot allow him to continue. And how do you intend to stop him? Asked Swift Eagle, although his tone suggested he already knew the answer. With the truth, she replied, taking the diary out of her bag. These pages contain confessions of his crimes, his conspiracies with corrupt politicians, the bribes he paid to cover up the massacre. If this reaches federal authorities, it would be your word against his, interrupted North Wind gently. A stray daughter who ran away with a savage. Who would believe it? I would believe it. A loud voice echoed across the clearing, making everyone turn around quickly. From the tree line emerged a tall, grey-haired man in a United States Army uniform. His tired eyes carried the weight of many battles, but there was kindness in his wrinkled features. Colonel Harrison, Swift Eagle greeted him with a respectful nod. The spirit said you would come. I received your message, replied the colonel, approaching the group. His eyes fell on Clara with genuine concern. Miss Richardson, your father has half a territory looking for you. Are you going to hand me over to him? Clara asked, unconsciously approaching North Wind. The colonel shook his head. No. I came because it is time to right a wrong that I allowed to happen 7 years ago. I knew of your father's plans for the Blackfoot village, but I did not act in time to stop the massacre. That failure has haunted me ever since. North Wind studied the officer intently. Why should we trust you? Because he was the only one who tried to warn us, Swift Eagle replied. The message came too late, but he never stopped trying to bring justice. The colonel nodded gravely. I've been gathering evidence against Samuel Richardson for years, but he was always too slippery, had too much political protection. But now, with the diary, it won't be enough, Clara interrupted, years of living with her father emerging in her voice. He will claim it is fake. He will use his influence to discredit any accusation. Unless, said the colonel slowly, we have something more, something he cannot deny or cover up. The survivors, murmured North Wind, understanding dawning in his eyes. In the valley? Exactly, Harrison confirmed. Witnesses to the massacre who can identify him, who can tell their stories in front of a federal court, with the diary corroborating their testimonies. He would be destroyed, Clara added, a mixture of sadness and determination in her voice. Not only punished for the massacre, but exposed for all his manipulations and crimes. But there is a price, warned Fast Eagle. The survivors would have to leave the safety of the valley, face the white world again. And you two, we would have to part, said North Wind, his voice filled with suppressed pain. To protect witnesses, to ensure justice is done. Clara turned to him, tears shining in her green eyes. No, there must be another way. It is the sacrifice that Wise Bear predicted, said Swift Eagle softly. Sometimes to build a future of peace, we must give up the present we desire. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the choice before them. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of melting snow and unspoken promises. How long? Clara finally asked, her voice shaky but determined. A few weeks, perhaps months, replied the colonel. The time it takes to gather witnesses, prepare the case, make sure everything is done within the law. North Wind held Clara's face in his hands, his dark eyes boring into hers. You taught me that there is more than one kind of strength, he said softly, that sometimes true courage is in choosing the hardest path, if it leads to justice. Promise you'll come back to me, she whispered, echoing words spoken before in another life. Until the stars fall from the sky, he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that carried all the love and all the pain of his choosing. Fast Eagle and the colonel discreetly walked away, giving the couple a moment of privacy to say goodbye. The sun had risen higher in the sky, its lights dancing through the pine branches like silent blessings on a love story that would need to be strong enough to survive separation. Peace had its price, and they had chosen to pay it. But as they embraced one last time before going their separate ways, both North Wind and Clara knew that their love was like the mountains around them, unwavering, eternal, able to survive any storm fate through their way. 3 months passed, like clouds across the Idaho sky. Autumn painted the mountains with shades of gold and crimson as Clara Richardson walked up the steps of the federal courthouse in Boise, her heart beating with the force of wild horses' hooves. His father's diary weighed in his bag like lead, each page a real loaded bullet ready to be fired. The courtroom was packed, government representatives, scandal-hungry journalists, and in the back rows, discreetly guarded by federal agents, Blackfoot survivors. Clara avoided looking at them initially, fearing that their presence would make her lose the composure she had rehearsed for weeks. Samuel Richardson was already there, imposing in his expensive suit, chatting with his lawyers, as if this were just another day of business. When her eyes met her daughter's, something trembled in her confident expression, perhaps the first crack in her armor of arrogance. Court is in session, the judge announced, and silence fell over the room like snow on the prairie. The next few hours were a battle unlike any Clara had ever faced. Every testimony from the Blackfoot survivors was a well-aimed arrow into the heart of their father's lies. Elderly women described the night of the massacre with firm voices despite their tears. Warriors told of the betrayal that followed promises of peace. And then, it was Clara's turn. "Miss Richardson," called the prosecutor, "please tell us about the diary." Clara stood up, her legs shaking slightly under her dark blue dress. As she walked to the witness stand, she thought of North Wind, of his quiet strength, of how he had taught her that true courage was in doing what was right, not what was easy. "This diary," she said, her voice clear and strong, "belongs to my father, Samuel Richardson. In it, he details not only the massacre of the Blackfoot village, but also the bribes, the conspiracies, and the plans to take Indian lands through premeditated violence." Samuel Richardson stood up abruptly. "I protest, Your Honor. My daughter has been corrupted by that savage. She is not in her right mind." "The only savage in this room," Clara replied, looking straight into her father's eyes, "is the man who ordered the massacre of innocents and then slept peacefully in his comfortable bed." The pages of the diary were read one by one, each entry revealing more of the web of lies and violence that Samuel Richardson had woven over the years. When Colonel Harrison presented his own documentation, corroborating each accusation, Clara saw something she never thought she would see: fear in her father's eyes. The trial lasted 5 days. In the end, when the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, Clara did not feel the satisfaction she had expected, just a deep tiredness and the feeling that a dark chapter in his life was finally ending. "You did the right thing," said Colonel Harrison, meeting her on the courthouse steps after the verdict. "Your testimony, along with the evidence and the survivors, it will change a lot." "Where is he?" Clara asked, knowing that Harrison would understand who he was talking about. "North Wind is waiting for you," he replied with a small smile. "In the valley." Clara wasted no time. With the colonel's help, she traveled to the mountains the next day, her heart beating stronger with each mile that brought her closer to her love. Swift Eagle found her in the same spot where they had parted months before, his wise eyes shining with approval. "You have proven yourself worthy of his love," said the old warrior as he led her down the path to the valley. "And most importantly, she has proven herself worthy." Blackfoot Valley was more beautiful than Clara had imagined. Colorful teepees dotted the green landscape, children played freely, and in the center of it all, next to a crystal-clear stream, was North Wind. When their eyes met, 3 months of separation dissolved like mist in the morning sun. He reached her in just a few steps, taking her into his arms with an intensity that spoke of lonely nights and days of agonizing waiting. "You did it," he murmured against her hair. "You brought justice to my people." "We did it," she corrected, pulling away just enough to look into his eyes. "And now?" "Now," said a deep voice behind them, "we begin to build bridges between our worlds." It was Wisebear, the old man Clara had only known through the stories of North Wind. His wrinkled face carried the wisdom of many seasons, and his eyes shone with renewed hope. "The council has decided," he continued, "that the time has come to open our valley to those who seek knowledge and understanding. Your school, young Clara, will be welcome here." Clara felt tears of joy running down her face. "A school where all children can learn together, where the stories of both peoples will be told," added North Wind, holding his hand, "where love can be stronger than hate." The sun was beginning to set over the mountains, painting the sky with the same colors that had witnessed their first meeting. But now, instead of persecution and fear, there was promise and hope in the evening air. "The stars didn't fall from the sky," Clara whispered, remembering the promise they had made. "And they will never fall," replied North Wind, sealing his words with a kiss that spoke of shared futures and realized dreams. In the Blackfoot Valley, where the mountains touched the sky and the winds carried ancient stories, a new chapter was beginning. A story not just of love between a warrior and a teacher, but of healing between two peoples, of bridges built over chasms of prejudice, of truth triumphing over lies. And in the nights that followed, when the valley's bonfires lit up the smiling faces of children of all colors learning together, when stories were shared in 2 languages, when love proved stronger than any border, North Wind and Clara knew they had found something more precious than gold. They had found a path to peace.